Hello, I'm back. I've gotten a refill of my beverage. Actually, do you really think there's tea in here? Could it be something else? Well, you just never really know with these things. And had my lunch, and now we can go on to the second part of our discussion of women in medieval England. In the first part, we summarized some of the external issues, the historiographical issues, and some of the evidentiary issues, limitations and possibilities in terms of the evidence for women's activity during the medieval period. What we're going to do in this part of the lecture is get down to specifics where we look at various broad categories of women, mostly economically, because that's what the evidence allows us to assess, and talk a bit about what their experiences were during this period, what opportunities were open to them, and we'll talk very generally about life cycle issues, what a woman could expect at every phase in her life in this sort of medieval environment. Um, so this section of the lecture is entitled Women and Work because that's what it's about mostly. And at the very end, we'll shift gears and talk briefly about women within a more spiritual context, where they might find another way to exercise their voice that was less public facing and more facing internally. Now, we should note that in terms of economic society, economic activities, women were prominent from classical antiquity through the 12th and 13th centuries. There's no question about that. They had roles in agriculture, in manufacturing of textiles, in brewing, in various types of administration, in healing, in fact, in the transmission and elucidation of religious knowledge. A lot of religious teaching within households was actually done by women during this period. And so what this led to during this time is a conception that there are various types of works or activities that are particularly associated with women. Muliebria opera was the Latin term for it. We should note that this begins to change at around 1300 onward, and this is the period that we're mostly talking about in this lecture, where their economic roles, women generally, became more circumscribed during that time. Actually, the whys and the wherefores of that will perhaps become more apparent when we talk about demographic issues in a later lecture more broadly for Europe, but it is an absolutely valid phenomenon. And it underscores that when Joan Kelly was talking about did women have a renaissance, there was in fact a basis for her analysis that this was not the greatest period in the world for women in terms of outward facing opportunities of various sorts. And so you see it certainly in terms of their economic roles in the 14th and 15th centuries. So we'll start out actually work from the ground up, since that's the way I tend to operate. We'll talk first about women who were part of the peasantry, peasant women. And we should remind you at the very beginning, you probably know this sort of inherently by this point because I've harped on these issues this semester, but that when you think about European society during the medieval period, the vast mass of the population, and this includes women, would come under the broad rubric of the peasantry, people living in the countryside, people laboring in the fields in agriculture, because you're in a remarkably agrarian society all the way through the end of the Middle Ages, actually into modernity, until we have the big agricultural revolution that created our modern economies to some extent. And so when you're talking about the peasantry, you're talking about the experience of most women. And so the first bit I'm going to talk about, it will give you a pretty good summary of the type of opportunities open to women in that broad category. And I should also, actually I didn't include this in the lecture, but it's worth mentioning here that since we're dealing with women mostly from an economic perspective, you should keep in mind an idea that was developed by actually a very famous medievalist. I think she's actually still alive, though retired probably now, a woman named Barbara Hannawalt. She wrote a really seminal book back in the 80s called The Ties That Bound, where she talked broadly about the experience of families in rural life and talked about women a lot in it. And there's a central idea in this that applies to the entire peasant economy. It's her notion of the economy of makeshifts. And what she meant by that is that these peasant families individually operated as tiny little economic units. They had their own familial economy. And the way that peasants got by is through what you might call makeshifts. They had their obligations to the Lord, and they would have to meet those. So part of their wherewithal would be drained every year because of their obligations to the Lord. Beyond that, they would do whatever they could to inject more into their own economy. And it's not any one thing, it's often a lot of different things. And every member of the family, from some perspective, would actually participate in that. Everybody would try to provide a little bit, even from a very early age. And women were particularly important in this economy of makeshifts in terms of making specific types of contributions to the family economy. And so we'll just sort of take it somewhat with the female peasants in terms of life cycle issues. So we'll start out with girlhood, and by this I mean uh, younger children, those not yet ready to leave the house. They didn't have a huge economic role because they were limited by the fact that they were children. They had to be supported rather than supporting other people for the most part. And if they made a contribution, and they did, it was restricted largely to the household economy. You could send the children out for useful errands. They could provide that as a service so somebody else wouldn't have to do it and could do something more productive for the household economy. And they could engage in certain tasks, such as, say, going out and collecting wood or collecting nuts and berries out in the forest. And we'll talk about that actually in another context a bit later. But there were small things, even as children, they could do as part of this economy of makeshifts to make a contribution to the household. In terms of a specific type of economic opportunity, women in a peasant context first get a chance to do something outside the household when, say, from around age 12 onward, they would be able to begin to engage in domestic service. This was a job they could actually do that would take them out of the family household. Basically, the manorial ward, as well as more prosperous peasants within the community, would usually have enough wherewithal to hire servants, domestic servants. And this was something, like I said, a girl could begin to do maybe at age 12 or 13. And when they were hired to do this, they would, in most instances, live with the people who had hired him, either the manorial ward, he would provide some sort of housing for them, and with the prosperous peasant families they work for. Of course, if it's in the community, they could still conceivably live at home and go out and work. But the point here is they could hire themselves out as servants. And what this meant is, of course, two types of work. They could work in the household itself, as most people in a modern conception would conceive of servants, or they could help with work in the fields. And they would do this quite frequently. Often they would do both. And actually, there is a term I should give you, a Latin word, which for some reason I didn't stick into this lecture, but I'll probably allude to it a couple of times during the course of it. I don't think it's on the overhead anywhere. It's famulus, Famulus. This was the generic term that you see in the records that refer to these servants. If you were a servant, you were a famulus, or sometimes they would make it feminine and call it a famula, but that was a fairly uncommon usage. They would just usually use the masculine for everybody, whether it was a man or a woman. And actually, I don't know if you picked up on this in the accounts since they were in English, but in most of these manorial accounts, and you had two of them actually in the past reading packet on Town and Country, you'll see allusions to the wages that the manorial ward gave to servants. These were these people, basically. And they weren't all domestic servants. They were like plowmen and carters. They were sort of like the permanent staff that the Lord would maintain within the manor, that worked for him for a wage and worked for him pretty much all the time, as opposed to the peasants who had labor obligations, but they were restricted in various ways. It was not a full-time occupation for them. And so these women could go to domestic service. Now, and what you should bear in mind is that there is this life cycle issue here, that these women who go in domestic service are usually fairly young, and the expectation in most instances is that after a certain point they would be involved in a marriage. They would get married. And when you have a marriage, in these circumstances, you have the formation of a new household or another new little economic unit. And this is where the women become very important and also least visible. The reason for the invisibility is that they tend to disappear from public records because of the legal rights of their husbands. We mentioned this concept of coverture, where they become covered legally within by their husband's authority. A way of thinking about it is the way I often put it in discussions of this is they disappear into the husband's legal penumbra, into his shadow at that point. And it's at this juncture, even though they're least visible, they're doing a wide range of things. Obviously, as a wife, when they have children, she becomes a mother and becomes very much intimately involved in childcare. Some things never change, actually, or perhaps not as much as they should. She cooks. She becomes a household manager. She basically tries to do the best she can with all the makeshifts that help to make this little tiny individual economy function. She becomes the husband's economic partner, essentially. They each have spheres. The spheres overlap. They both have managerial concerns, but she is particularly managing the household economy. And if the husband is ever absent, she is the absolute head of the household in his absence. And so she does a lot of stuff. There are many things, many types of work that she has to do. In these peasant families, she also tends to have control of the garden. We mentioned with these peasant residences, usually there's some sort of little garden around it in which they could grow some vegetables and some herbs and that sort of thing for their own personal consumption. And these gardens are a very important part of this economy of makeshift, actually, where they put things together enough to support themselves as decently as they can in any given year, which opens up an interesting question. You have these tiny little individual family economies in the village, and then you have the broad manorial economy of the entire manor. And what role did these women play in that? Well, we should note about the labor obligations, and you got to read about Hugh Miller and all these peasants and what they owed in terms of rents and services every year. The labor obligations are usually placed on each man as head of a household. So they're the person who is they're expected to render it, the men are, or to provide somebody from within their family to render it. So it's the men who are most directly involved in most instances, depending upon the type of obligation, particularly the labor obligations. However, in some circumstances, everybody, including the wife and sometimes even the children, are involved in these labor services, particularly for the customary boon labors that we talked about during the busy seasons, and most especially during the harvest. When it was harvesting season, everybody would go out into the fields because that's when you needed to get work done very quickly, get the crops in that year, because it was crucial to the community's survival. So women would be involved in that. They would also labor on the family's own strips during the course of the growing season. They would help with the harvest, but they would also hoe and winnow. And I don't know if you know what winnowing is. It's after you've harvested the grain. It's basically threshing it and getting the grain out from the husk and that sort of thing. And women were heavily involved in that as an agricultural activity for their own grain when they brought their sheaves in after the harvest. And so that's sort of the role that women played in the manorial economy. They would work sometimes in a public sense. They would certainly work in a private sense in their own household from the proceeds of that economy. Which leads us, of course, to a more general discussion of occupations. Say that a woman wanted to do something other than these things we've talked about, either domestic service as a life cycle occupation or serving as a wife in a household. What kind of activities could a woman be involved in independently of this as an economic activity? Now, where you find out most about this is from basically fines and amercements in manorial courts. It's the best evidence for the type of economic activities in which a woman could engage. And when you look at the courts, there are some activities which we would call licit or legal, or activities that have the stamp of approval. There are other activities which are illicit, and we'll sort of talk a bit about both. In terms of licit activities where you often see women working, you can see them working in poultry and dairy production. It's a sort of a specialist thing. If you think about the famulists, the notion of these servants, if you look at most manors and you look at the lord's group of famuli, which is of course the plural for famulus, you will see an official that is in Latin called the dea. And if you translate that literally, that is the dairymaid. but actually it's an occupation that either men or women could engage in. It's a paid occupation, and sometimes men do it, but frequently actually women become a manorial dea, which means that she is being paid a wage to engage in a type of poultry and cow management, essentially. So that's a job that would be open to women within the broader manorial category. You often see women actually beyond this being hired to wash and shear sheep. And we have records of these wages that would appear in the manorial accounts. You also see women hiring themselves out to do weeding in the field. And they'll also frequently actually do thatching, because you have these thatch roofs on many structures during this period, and this was an occupation that both men and women engaged in, so women could hire themselves out to work as a thatcher or as a thatcher's assistant. It wasn't a totally uncommon thing. You certainly have women in the countryside being involved in weaving and spinning, which these have always been occupations associated with women from time immemorial, and this certainly continued to be the case during the Middle Ages. Um, so you see them doing these range of things to be able to hire themselves out, usually on the basis of, sometimes by the day or half day, sometimes on the basis of piecework. And what I mean by that is being paid for completion of a specific activity, regardless of the amount of time it takes. You would often see something like that with weaving or spinning, or with washing of sheep and shearing of sheep. You get paid for the number of sheep that you actually wash and shear. They could get the wage structure could work in both directions. And in some cases, for some activities, it could be one or the other, either by day, not by hour, because they didn't think so much in those terms, or by piecework. Now, you begin to learn a bit more about this, about women's activities in terms of wage labor after the Black Death, because you had the issuance of this thing called the Statute of Laborers, which we will talk about in the next topic, which tried to regulate wages and hold them down. And you will frequently see women being brought before the justices who enforce this law and being charged with levying excess wages, trying to make more than the statute of laborers would legally permit. And so you see women actually trying to help themselves out. Men do this as well. It's a common thing after the Black Death for people to violate the statute of laborers. But you see specifically women doing that, and it's nice in that extent because you can see them engaging in that activity, and you have them named. You know what's going on in that respect. Now, this opens up the question that when these people engaged in these licit or approved activities for money, what kind of pay did they get? Well, when men and women did the same task, particularly agrarian task, say it's shearing sheep and washing them, they would usually receive the same wage, although you can find exceptions to that. Sometimes you see a disparity even when they're doing the same work. But the problem here for women is that they tended to be directed toward less skilled and less physically challenging tasks. That's what was left open for them, which meant that these tasks, which required less, also paid less, no matter who performed them. And so since women tended to gravitate, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily, to these sorts of types of work, it meant that on average they made less. And this is, of course, this wage disparity between men and women. It's something with which we still contend. When I was younger, when I was, going into college, the figure you would hear is that women would make basically 65 cents to every dollar that a man makes. It's improved somewhat, but there's still a fairly large disparity there. And so, this is something that historically has been a long-term trend. And obviously it's improved some, but we're not there yet in terms of evening that out in any comprehensive way. Now, so those are legal activities. Then you would have more illicit or non-legal activities. Part of what you would frequently see women engaging in, and they get charged for this when they get caught. And so we only know about the people who got caught. We don't know how many people actually did it, because a lot of them maybe succeeded at it. You would assume some people don't get caught or they wouldn't be doing it. You see the violation of some of the Lord's monopolies, and we'd mentioned this in our discussion of the countryside, that the Lord had monopoly control over certain types of assets within a manor's physical plant. The most common thing that would be violated would be his forest, his wood, where people would actually literally go out and take wood from the forest or get nuts and berries, and they would send their kids out to do it illegally. So they made them scofflaws at a very young age. And this is very obviously part and parcel of this notion of economy of makeshifts, that you need to get a hold of what you can. And this is something that if you're very careful about it, you could do it and inject these little extra things into the family economy. Uh, you also would see illegal gleaning occurring. And since a lot of you guys aren't that familiar with agriculture or how things operate in the countryside, that requires a little bit of explanation, although there are a lot of allusions to it in scripture, actually, believe it or not. Basically, you have the harvest occur where all the grain's taken up. Now, in any harvest, particularly because of the speed sometimes in which people would engage in it to get the crops in, you always have leavings in the field, basically. A few sheaves that didn't cut down or got trampled down, if you're talking about grain. You have basically grain that fell off the stalks. And in the Christian sense of this, and this is a very Christian society, the gleaning of the fields was left to the poor, that this was a type of social support for people who were down on their luck at the very margins of society. But so it's legal, illicit for the poor to go out and engage in this activity. What happens, however, is you find people who aren't in that category going out and doing it, and you will frequently see women being charged, maybe being sent out by their husbands to try to sneak some of this extra grain and add it to this makeshift economy by which the household was operating. Now, I can actually give you a personal example about this. When I grew up in the countryside, I've mentioned this at a couple of points, and when we were young, as sort of a personal project, we weren't. I wasn't living on a farm, actually, generally speaking, for most of that time. When my mom remarried in 1968, she married an army guy, or a guy who was just coming out of the army, and they bought a house with a couple of acres attached to it, so we had a little bit of land, and there was actually a barn on this property. And in terms of my farm experience, it was mostly through my grandfather that I had that, because he had much more land and operated sort of a tobacco operation with some other side activities in it. And I was exposed to that as a child and as a teenager. But in our own house, we did have this barn, back a small one. And so what my parents did at one point is, and did this for my brother and for me at the same time, they purchased for each of us a calf to raise. And so we started them out really young, but we'd have to take since we didn't have the cow to feed them directly when they were young, we had to take these, they're called nipple buckets, where you put in this mix that basically is a dry substitute for milk, and you mix it up in a bucket with warm water, and you hang the bucket over the edge of the stall, and there's this nipple on the side of it, and the calf realizes pretty quickly that that's just like mom, or something like mom, and you feed them that way. So we would have to feed them, and once they were weaned, then we would have to feed them grain. And so what my stepfather arranged for us to do at one time is, after the big corn harvest that year, he asked one of the local farmers if we could go out and glean in the fields a little bit. And the guy said sure, because they never pick up that stuff once the mechanical harvesters go through. And so what my brother and my stepfather and I did is, we took his pickup truck out into this gigantic cornfield, and we just walked through it, picking up all the ears of corn that had been missed. And we loaded up an entire, truckload of it, took it back to the house, put it in the barn in a crib, and that's what and we would basically, we had this old-fashioned device that we would use to get the grains off of a field corn cob. We would run it through that, and we would have the corn, and that's what we would feed those calves, among other things. We had some other things we would buy at the store, but my parents thought this was a good experience for us to have, and so this is part of this gleaning activity where there are leavings, and then the question is, who has access to them? In modern agriculture in America, they're usually just left there, unfortunately. A lot gets wasted in that respect. And so you have this illegal gleaning that people would engage in. You would also, along the same lines, you would have illegal grazing. you have common grazing in these villages. There are rules set by which the peasants can take their livestock, such as they have, and graze them at certain places at certain time on common assets, pasture assets within the village. But it's really great for your cattle if you can do more. And it also allows you, if you do it illegally, if you can do it surreptitiously, you might be able to keep extra livestock as part of this economy of makeshifts. And so you often have women charged when they've been caught actually grazing animals on other people's land, sometimes on other people's crops, or violating the commons in some way. Not the most, it's kind of an antisocial activity. Beyond the illegal grazing, there's something that you often see women charged with, and that's going out into the field, into other people's sheep flocks, maybe under cover of darkness, and they take some shears with them and start shearing the wool off of other people's sheep. They would steal wool, actually. They would clip them in the fields, bag it up, take it home, and then that's something they could either use domestically, or you can. There's a market for that. You can sell it and make a little bit of money that way. And you very frequently have women being charged with that. And again, it fits under this broad category of injecting something within the household domestic economy. Another thing women were another thing women were frequently charged with was the use of a hand kern. And we had alluded to this very briefly when we were talking about the Lord's monopolies on these manors. Essentially, what a hand kern is, a hand mill. And it's a little thing. You keep it in your house, and you could actually grind grain with it down into flour so you can then bake it into bread. The reason why this is an illegal activity, of course, is that the mill, whether it's a water mill or a windmill in the village, is a monopoly controlled by the Lord. And the Lord requires, in fact, that everybody pay suit to mill. And what that means is that everybody has to grind their grain at the Lord's mill. They can't grind it anywhere else. And if the Lord discovered that a peasant had a hand kern, he would come out with Mr. Sledgehammer and break the thing up. Well, it doesn't mean people don't get away with it, however. And so, and to the degree you see people charged with it, and frequently it's women who are charged with this use of a hand kern, it means that if they're successful at it, they don't lose the amount of grain that you would normally lose by using the Lord's monopoly, where he would charge a fee. Either you save some money or you save some grain. It works for them either way in terms of domestic economy. And women sometimes would maintain this. Sometimes they might set up a little sort of illicit business where they would do some of their own, and for a lower charge than what the Lord would levy, do some for some of their neighbors. And so you do see this going on as an illicit activity that women engaged in. Now, there's another activity that's both licit and illicit in a peculiar way. By this, I'm talking about brewing ale, and baking of bread. In England, you have this thing called the assize, or the law of bread and ale in England. Basically what happens in the kingdom is, by royal edict, you have a standardization of weight and bread measures and a set of requirements, quality requirements, that people are expected to adhere to if they're going to produce bread and ale for sale and consumption by other people. And within the villages, I think we've already had alluded to this, you have these officials called the Testatori Cervizii, or the tasters of ale, which is sometimes translated as the testers of ale. Tasters is probably a better translation, because the testing did involve tasting. These guys wanted to make sure that skunky ale wasn't being sold, and to satisfy themselves of that, they had to take a belt or two or three to ensure that. And actually, it could be kind of dangerous, because you get a hold of some of the skunky stuff, you get pretty sick doing it. So there's a certain amount of risk involved in the office. But the reason why this is important here is that in terms of production of bread and ale, these were occupations that women were heavily involved in. And we know this because they are frequently charged with breaking the assize of bread and ale. They appear in the basically manorial court rolls all the time for this, and you do get the impression that these are largely feminine occupations in the countryside. Women are more involved in it than men, although you do see men involved in it as well. Um, and the interesting bit about this is that if you have a long series of court rolls, and we frequently do, what you'll discover is that the same woman will be charged with breaking the assize in virtually every meeting of the court. And what that tells you is that this charging of this fee, it maybe is no longer so much a punishment for doing something illegal as it is a licensing fee. And it tells you that the women are making enough from this, doing it, week in, week out, producing bread and ale, maybe running even something like a little tavern, which you have actually out in the countryside, that it's worth paying the charge, because you see them paying it every time and they don't stop doing it. And so this is one of the occupations where you can track women's involvement in it in individual villages pretty specifically. And it sometimes over the course of the long period tends to run in families, which tells you that, yeah, it's probably sort of like a tavern operation, particularly for the ale production there. And so, as a subsidiary occupation, you often see women as maltsters. And what I mean by that are it's the occupation of taking barley and converting it into malt for use in brewing to make ale. And so this was very much a feminine activity during this period. There are men involved, but it's in most instances more women than men in any specific village. And so those are the sorts of opportunities within the village that most women would have. And as you can see, it's probably not too surprising that everything, almost with no exception, is associated with either growing a food or food preparation in some fashion. And so this is what you would see women doing mostly, to the degree they would have an occupation outside of their household. Which leads us to the second big social grouping, the bourgeoisie. We'd mentioned them in reference to development of towns. And in terms of range of potential occupations open to women, it was widest within the urban context. There were more different things that they could do there. It's not to say that they weren't limited, they absolutely were, but they had more options. You could pick and choose a little bit. We should also note that there's also somewhat of a life cycle issue involved here as well. The age of a woman had some impact on the sort of thing that she might be doing. And so we'll start out here actually at somewhat the same place that we started out with these women in the countryside, with this notion of domestic service. We should note that domestic service was more common in the city than it was in the countryside. There were just many more job openings because you have a little bit more affluence within this bourgeois grouping than you do generally in the countryside. There were more people who were able to afford to have a domestic servant of some sort. In terms of urban servants, you find very few of them that are younger than 12. It's around age 12 that they tend to go out and do it. You find very few of them who are older than their mid-20s. And so this is very clearly a type of life cycle employment that women will do it during their adolescence and through their early mature years. And then after that, they would usually tend to be doing something else. Some of these women moved from employer to employer on the basis of short-term, usually annual contracts. And so you could actually serve a number of different families during the course of kind of a career as a domestic servant. Some of the servants were related to their employers. In other words, if they're sort of a broad extended family within a town, you might hire your daughter might decide to become a domestic servant with some of your cousins or something like that. That was not a totally unusual sort of thing to have. In terms of the type of compensation that they would usually get room and board and clothing just given to them, which meant that wages were minimized. They would get some payment, they would make some money out of it, but a lot of it was given to them in kind. And in terms of individual household economies, it means that this woman is becoming self-supporting in a different household, which means it reduces stress on her home household, the place from which she came. And it allows her to acquire a little wherewithal as she moves into the next phase of her life cycle. So she works, she gains experience, and she gains a bit of money, not a huge amount, because her material needs are being taken care of in another way. And these women, when they would go into these households, they were expected to help to some degree in the workshop if there was one, because all these families are doing something to make a living, whether it's engaging in commerce or engaging in some sort of artisanal activity. And they help around the house in the sense of a domestic servant, clean and cook, that sort of thing. And so domestic service was what a lot of women, young women, would do uh, during that period of their lives for about a decade, decade and a half, maybe tops. Then, of course, many of them get married if they can. They become wives and they enter the household economy. Um, for women in well-to-do households, this was a considerable job because of the complexity of an upper bourgeois household. If you want to learn about this, actually the best primary source for it is actually not an English source, but it's a French source. It's a very famous one, Le Ménage de Paris, the Paris Householder. It's an annoying thing to read. It's written by actually an older member of the bourgeoisie, a successful businessman on the continent who has married a much younger wife. And in the most condescending terms possible, he explains to her what she has to do to make him happy. And so he details all the types of domestic activity that she needs to engage in to make him convinced that he's living in the perfect household. He's kind of a jerk. I say that as you read it. And I have in my larger late medieval course, it is something I assign people to read so they can see how this fellow describes the type of domestic management that he thinks is ideal, that the wife should provide. And what you discover is that for her, and this is a very young woman at this time, this is going to be a very complicated job. And the husband's expectation is that she may not be perfect at first, but she'll eventually grow into it. And like I said, it's incredibly condescending in terms of tone and content. Now, if for less prosperous women marrying a little lower down on the socioeconomic scale, their circumstance is not too dissimilar from the situation in the countryside. It's sort of a economy of makeshifts thing, where she has the same sorts of managerial responsibilities and does whatever she can to make a contribution. The one difference is that women in the family also become involved in whatever the family business is. And so they engage in a activity which is a little bit different than what the women in the countryside would have participated in. What the wife is considered in this context is a source of cheap and readily available labor in the family's business concern. And so it's even a little bit more than what you would see in the countryside. Which leads us to the sort of public institutions within the town and the extent to which a woman could engage in them, become part of them. Well, we should mention one thing first, just to sort of set the context for this. Only burgesses or citizens were entitled to set up shops, to employ apprentices, or to participate in urban elections. And it was very difficult for a woman ever to acquire citizenship, to tell you the truth. It would happen in some towns, but without this, she's not able to become part of the guild structure, and so there is a limitation placed on women at the very beginning. We should note that in terms of membership in guilds, the merchant guild or the artisans guilds that we talked about before, there's a division between England and the continent on this, that basically on the continent, female participation in guilds is more common than it is in England. There's a slight division in that regard. Some towns did not grant citizenship or membership in guilds to women. What they would grant them is basically a license to engage in a trade on a year-to-year basis. In other words, they weren't part of the guild, but if the guild was convinced that their participation wouldn't damage the guildsmen, that they wouldn't provide so much competition that it would dim their prospects economically, they might make a year-to-year decision to let a woman or two or three actually engage in that trade. But it was subject to a year-by-year decision. It was not something that a woman could move into and then think that she's going to be able to do this, ad infinitum. It's very much a year-by-year thing. It's very restricted. In terms of the apprenticeship structure, there were very few female apprentices during this period, because if you're not going to get guild membership and not be able to become a master, then usually the resources would not be wasted on a female apprentice. if they get any sort of training, it's through domestic service in most instances. And what I mean by that is that if they're working in a household or a particular trade is being done, they learn a lot by being asked to be involved in it as cheap labor, basically through their domestic situation. And they would often learn about a trade in that way, not by being in an official sort of apprenticeship situation where the assumption is you're going to be an apprentice for a while, you're going to be a journeyman, and you're going to become a master and part of the guild eventually. Um, and again, there's a division between England and the continent on this. It was more common for women to gain admission to a guild on the continent than in England, but even then, it's usually in the lower crafts and trade. You don't see a lot of women in the merchant guild, or the town guild. It's usually a little closer to the ground. Many guilds forbade members to place any woman under employment other than wives and daughters. They didn't want actually these businesses hiring women for these jobs because women's wages were generally a little lower and people feared being undercut, basically, in terms of having to pay wages by having a lot of women involved in these various trades as sort of hired day laborers or term laborers. And so they would place restrictions on that within the towns. And even when a trade was dominated by women, and there are some that are, they were rarely accorded status as a guild. And the best example here is the silk industry. You do have silk weavers in London, and most of them are women, but they're not given guild status in London. But I should note here that when you move to the continent, there are instances when they actually are given guild status in these female-dominated occupations. So this is where, again, England's a little different from the continent. There is somewhat of a divide. Now, there is one exception, a very broad exception, to women's ability to engage in any of these trades, and it's a life cycle exception. It's widowhood. And I don't recall whether we mentioned this in regard to the peasantry, because it applies there to some degree as well. It certainly applies to women in the urban context, that if you're a widow, then you have more opportunities and you reappear actually legally as an individual entity as long as you don't remarry. And so this is where, to go back to the countryside for a moment, when you look at these manorial records, when you see women appearing in various contexts, they're appearing because they're widows, or they haven't gotten married yet. So it's this notion that the bookends of a woman's life cycle, when she's very young before marriage, when she's a bit older after her husband has died, then she has legal competence and she tends to appear in records more. Which brings us back to Cecilia Pennefatter, this woman that Judith Bennett writes about in A Medieval Life. As we've mentioned on a couple of occasions, what Judith Bennett claims to do in this book is to write a biography of a peasant woman. And you ask yourself, well, how could she do that, particularly if the woman was married? Because the woman would disappear within her husband's legal penumbra. Well, the reason why Judith Bennett claims she can do something close to biographical with Cecilia Pennefatter is that she never married, and she engaged in a type of trade in the countryside, which meant that she showed up with some frequency in the manorial accounts and court records for this place called Bridgestock, where she lived. And so it gave Judith Bennett just enough material to hang a little bit on. And I've had a tough time thinking about that as a real biography because it is very limited. There are a lot of things you would really want to know about Cecilia Pennefatter you're never going to learn. But you know enough to make some generalizations. And what Judith Bennett does very skillfully in that book is she uses Cecilia Pennefatter's experiences to hang as sort of a structure on which to hang discussions more broadly of aspects of rural life. And that's why I really like the book, because it talks about a lot of other things beyond Cecilia Pennefatter. It provides a wonderful context for her, if nothing else. And that's why I've assigned it, repeatedly in courses over the years. But the point here, in the urban context, what you would see is a widow, after her husband died, if her husband was fairly prosperous, she would set herself up in business. And basically, there's a great example of it. There's this woman in Coventry who was named Marjorie Russell, and she was the widow of a merchant, which meant that her husband was a high sort of social value person. He was in the top guild in the town. The merchant guild is always the most prestigious guild socially and economically, and you have the most prosperous members of the society gravitating toward it. Well, it's clear that in her widowhood, she was not in any hurry to get married, and she actually engaged in her husband's merchant business. We know about this because she got involved in a legal process. And what happened basically is that, and it gives you some idea of the extent of the business she was engaging in. Uh, Her business, her representatives, I would assume, were robbed of 800 pounds of merchandise by men in Spain. And so it tells you that they were trading in Spain, all the way from Coventry. They were heading across to the continent, and they were engaged in pretty high value trade. 800 pounds was 800 pounds back then. Hell, 800 pounds is 800 pounds now. You hand it to me, I'd take it. And it's pretty good money. And by their standards, it's a small fortune, obviously. And the reason why we know about this is she went into the British courts and acquired a writ, which enabled her to compensate herself at the expense of some Spanish merchant in England. What that means is, obviously, if they get taken by somebody over in Spain, they'll not be able to go over in Spain and enforce it there to get it back. But if there's a Spaniard with sufficient wherewithal banging around England, and you manage to get a hold of him, you can take it out of him. And so that's how these things kind of operated, which I've always found amusing. You always had to be careful when you're a merchant because you never know what your compatriots might have done that will get you in trouble with you having not done anything. And that was the case with Marjorie Russell of Coventry, who apparently set herself up as a fairly successful businesswoman during her widowhood. And this is not a totally uncommon thing, where women, and this is also true in the crafts at a lower level, where women during their widowhood take over their husband's businesses, and they become pretty good at it. And they are allowed to be associated with the guild at that point. And so that's the one big exception. Now, in terms of women engaging in independent economic ventures, I just gave you widowhood as an exception, but say you're not a widow and you want to set yourself up in some sort of business. How do you do it? Should note first that the ability of women to find employment was limited by several factors, by their training, by the amount of, by their social stratum, and by the amount of capital that they had, basically. If you want to start into some sort of business, you need enough wherewithal to actually do it. We should note that the husband in a married relationship had the right to know of and consent to all economic ventures in which a wife might engage. The wife is never supposed to do anything without the husband's permission in terms of operating in some sort of economic concern. And part of the reason for this is that the husband would be responsible for any debts or breaches of contract by his wife unless the wife was engaging in business in a totally separate way. And again, it's this notion of women losing their legal competence once they're married. And the inheritance laws limited access for women to funds to engage in business. In terms of women engaging in economic ventures independently in towns, it's the single women who are the most interesting, the ones who never marry for one reason or another. They needed to do something to support themselves, and we mentioned this disparity in sexual ratios, that there are generally more women than men, particularly in towns. They can't all marry, so they need to find some sort of occupation ultimately to support themselves. And what single women would tend to do is gravitate toward businesses whose initial outlay in capital was very modest, where you didn't have to have a lot to get yourself set up. They often find themselves involved in what are called buy industries. These are occupations that are subsidiary to larger concerns. A big concern would be something like cloth manufacturing. That's a major industry during the Middle Ages. You tend to be big concerns. A buy industry would be some sort of craft or activity that contributes to that in some way. It could be part of the process. It could be working in fulling. It could be weaving, spinning, those sorts of things that contribute to this larger industry. This woman alone, there's a term for her, a French term. She's called the femme sole, the woman alone. Now, as we already noted, widows are somewhat of an exception here because they're more likely to invest in businesses. They would reclaim their dowry, and any inheritance from their late husband, these two things put together, would give them capital that they could then invest in a business concern. So they could do something that's a little bit more large scale. And again, you go back to Marjorie Russell of Coventry in that respect. But in terms of the low capital investment things, what would they find themselves doing? As in the countryside, a lot of them would become involved in victualling. In other words, they would be in the food service and production and provision industry. Heavy involvement in brewing. You often see women running taverns. You know, the concept of the barmaid and that sort of thing. It's a very medieval thing. But women, as in the countryside, so in the city, they would engage in brewing and baking and those sorts of activities on a commercial basis. There were also some quasi-illicit activities in which they would engage. One of these activities is something called forestalling. And this is usually, when it's done, a violation of town and guild regulations. What is forestalling? Well, you know, you have market days in towns, and actually I alluded to that a little bit in the last lecture, and everybody knows when they are. And what a forestaller would do is they know these vendors and merchants are going to be coming to town on market day. They would leave town before these people arrive and intercept them outside the town, and they would buy some of their goods from them there. And they might be able to negotiate a better price. It keeps, you know, the merchant from even having to carry all the stuff around with them. And what they can then do is they can take these goods back into the city, and then they can sell them at slightly lower prices, or they could sell them. And members of the guild, they're sometimes permitted to do this, but people outside the guild aren't. But you would see women engaging in this forestalling activity because it could lead to a greater margin of profit for them. And so that's one way that women could make a little bit. Another activity that women frequently engaged in, which is also quasi-illicit, is something called regrading. Um, Probably the easiest way to illustrate this one, this is also a violation of most town and guild regulations, but the way this works, it's take bread. Well, what a woman could do is she could go to the local baker and buy some loaves of bread. And then what she could then do is cut the breads into portions and sell them in non-standard quantities piece by piece. And what this allows her to do is to charge a slightly larger amount for each piece and sell it to people who didn't want to buy a whole loaf, who just wanted to buy part of the loaf of bread. And by charging slightly more for each individual bit, she's able to turn a profit over what she paid to buy the loaf of bread to begin with. It's basically, you're not going to make a ton off of it, but you can scrape out a living that way. And actually, we have modern examples of this. There's actually one very disturbing example that I think you've all heard about, where somebody's engaging in that sort of activity. You may recall a number of years ago, there was a man in New York named Eric Garner, a gentleman, African-American man. That's a relevant part of the story in this respect because this became a cult celeb. What he was doing, well, you know what happened to him. He was eventually basically got into a fracas with the police, and very aggressive New York policeman basically wrestled him down to try to handcuff him. And as he's being wrestled down, apparently the man had an asthmatic condition, and he kept saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe," and he dies as a result of it. And this, and it's on videotape. Actually, it's a very disturbing thing to watch. The reason why I mentioned him here is so it'll cement regrading in your mind, because he was doing a version of that. What Eric Garner was doing that got the police's attention is he was standing outside a store, and he was selling cigarettes by the cigarette. It's called selling loosies because the sale of tobacco is very heavily regulated both federally and by state and local law, and you're supposed to be selling cigarettes either in packs or in cartons, not as individual cigarettes. And the way the Lucy thing works is it's like the same thing with a loaf of bread. You buy a pack of cigarettes, you can sell each one of them individually for a little bit more than they would have cost if you bought the entire pack. And then you get to pocket the extra bit, and that's what he was doing. that why he was standing out there, and part of the reason why you have that altercation which led to his death. Now, beyond these quasi-illegal activities like forestalling and regrading, there were some other low capital occupations which were actually more or less legal that women would engage in. They could become hucksters. Well, what is a huckster? It's a retailer of small articles, sort of like a peddler, that you see basically. You can become a tranter, and this is a peddler or a higher grade one that has a horse and a cart, where they're doing a little bit better. You have women serving as spinsters, people who spin yarn. This was an occupation open to women. Women as weavers, women as kempsters, and these are basically wool carders. You have women working as shepsters or dressmakers quite frequently. You would have women who would set up businesses as laundresses because you need laundry done in the city, sort of their version of dry cleaning. Any number of piecework operations because that's what these were largely. And then there is the one final low capital occupation that women would engage in. You have women who engage in prostitution. And this is something that's becoming more and more studied because there is, in the late Middle Ages, better evidence where the urban authorities try to regulate it and stamp it out in some instances. So these are the sorts of things that were open as low capital entrees into conducting a type of business. And we should reiterate something here that this entire notion of women in the town, part of what governs it, particularly from the perspective of marriage, is that you have all these single men trying to make their way in town as well. And they want to marry, and what they particularly look for is for women with substantial dowries. And we mentioned what dowry is. It's part of the agreement between the families when a marriage is contracted. And it's what the wife comes in with by gift of her family. And why these men wanted to contract the best marriage they could, because the dowry would become a source for their own business ventures, a source of capital. And so this is part of how women were viewed in town if they were from a fairly substantial family. The notion of trying to contract a marriage so you could have access to the woman's dowry to engage in business activities. Now, so we've dealt with the peasantry, we've dealt with the bourgeoisie in terms of the types of options open to women there. We'll say a few words now about the nobility, and this we'll get through in a lot less time because there's actually less to say. When you think about noble women in terms of their economic activities, it is in the household. They don't do much outside of it. But we should note within the household, their responsibilities could be very heavy. They had to be able to manage the household and the estate associated with it in their husband's absence, because a husband who was involved in the political military hierarchy could frequently be absent for considerable periods of time. Or think about a husband who took up the cross and went on crusade. It means that his wife is left there with the managerial staff that he left behind, but she essentially is running the show in his absence. And so many of these women become quite skilled in this type of large-scale household and estate management just out of necessity. It was left to them to do it in certain intervals, periods of their life. We should note also that these noble women have less responsibility for children. They have them, but because they have wet nurses and because they can send children at a certain age to other nobles' houses for education, they weren't as heavily involved in child rearing as their opposite numbers would be in the countryside. And it also meant that it was possible for these women to have more children than the peasantry because they could just support more economically. So you could see slightly larger families produced at the upper level of noble society. In terms of what they did in the household, these women oversaw the manufacturing of clothing and foodstuffs for the house. And they oversaw the provisioning of the household from markets and fairs. And so they would actually go out into that part of the world and acquire the needs that the house had. And they would also supervise the domain and the dairying operations on these estates. And so they have fairly extensive responsibilities from a domestic perspective as part of the noble household. But the larger point here is that they are barred from other economic ventures. They don't get to work outside. That would be considered a basically demeaning for a noble woman to do that. She's not expected to go out and work, basically. And so their experience would be within this marital unit once they're married or in their father's household prior to that. That's the expectation. Now, so those are the three basic categories of women that we needed to talk about. There's one other brief thing I want to mention before we close, and it has to do with women in religious life. And an interesting question has been posed that we mentioned how during the 13th and 14th centuries, the opportunities for women tended to dwindle. And the reasons for that will become evident when we deal with our next big topic, the demographic issues of the late medieval period. But it opens up an interesting question. As their public and economic roles narrowed, as there was not, in fact, a Renaissance for women, if you buy Joan Kelly's formulation of it, were women able to exercise influence and power in other ways? Was there another avenue, another sphere of activity in which they could establish, as Thomas Kuhn would call it, their social personhood? And the argument is that, yeah, in fact, there was. That religious and spiritual power was a possibility. But it's one of those things, it's so abstract that it's very difficult to gauge. But we'll take a crack at it. Actually, I won't take a crack at it because I have done no research in this, obviously, but other people have. And there's one person in particular I want to mention here because he did a very interesting study on this a number of years back, actually quite a few years back now. It's a man named David Herlihy. And in his generation, he's an American medievalist, taught in the Midwest initially, but ended up at Harvard and ultimately at Brown University. He was one of the deans of medievalists of his time. He died actually kind of young, and part of the reason why I mention this, it allows me to give a little shout out to my wife, Professor Drell. When my wife she was an undergraduate at Wellesley College, went to graduate school at Brown. She is a elite public school, private school person, private university person, and I am the institutional opposite of that. I am associated with the large public mega universities. And we've managed to negotiate that over the years about what the actual meaning of that is. Um, we've educated one another in some respects. Of course, the obvious question is who has educated whom more. I won't answer that, but I have a clear sense in my mind what the proper answer to that is, but I'll leave that one alone. The reason why I mention this is that when my wife was at Brown, David Hurley, he was there, and actually he was the person who persuaded her to go there. And so he was sort of the recruiting person, and he was her academic advisor during the early phases of her graduate student career at Brown. What then happened, unfortunately, is that David Hurley, he contracted cancer and died in 1991 when Joanna was probably in her fourth year of graduate school at that point. The larger point is that we'd met in the summer of 1990, and so he passed away at about the time that Joanna and I actually got together. We met in Chicago in the summer of 1990, and in terms of becoming a couple, that happened earlier the next year, and he died within a few months after that. And so very sad, which meant that Joanna became an inherited student for another professor at Brown, their Renaissance person, in fact. And what Joanna did at that point, under Herlihy, her intention had been to study medieval England. Since she was taken on by their Renaissance person, a man named Anthony Mulho, she shifted fields and went into Italy, which was, I think, a great choice. She's done very well there. And from a personal perspective, it meant that we've had this neat sort of existence where at various points when I was in England, she would visit me, which is great. And when she's in Italy, I have a very good excuse to go down there. And so it's been kind of fantastic in that regard, although it was very unfortunate David Hurley, he died, and that's what led to it. Why I mentioned Hurley here is he was curious about this question, about whether women could have another way of exercising a type of social personhood, having a way of asserting themselves outside of these economic realms and public realms that we talked about. And he focused on spirituality. And so what he did, knowing that this is a very abstract thing and there's no precise way to measure it, but he was a very systematizing type of person. He tried to make it as systematic as possible, even though it's hard to systematize. He began to look at saints' lives and saints' cults. And he collated the number of female saints as a way of measuring religious and spiritual power exercised by women as it waxed and waned over time. To have a cult established and to become a saint, you need a certain amount of public recognition. People have to recognize that you engage in a particular type of activity. And so what he did is he looked at the male saints and the female saints, and he established sexual ratios of saints, the number of women as opposed to the number of men across various periods across time. And he arrived at some very interesting conclusions doing that, and I thought it was a very clever thing to do. Uh, he notes that although male saints always outnumber female saints in every period, and that's to be expected, the proportion of female saints was relatively high from, say, around 450 to about 750. So you're thinking at the end of antiquity in the West as you're moving into the early Middle Ages. Then from around 751 to 1347, just before the Black Death, in effect the early Middle Ages and all the High Middle Ages, the proportion of female saints declined sharply, that there are more men proportionally than women, or fewer women, however you want to express it. But the ratio shifts. And then, interesting thing, from 1348 to 1500, basically the late Middle Ages, Italian Renaissance, if you're in Italy, the proportion of female saints increases again, that the ratios shift back to sort of an earlier standard. And it's also clear that these female saints largely are more influential and prominent. You have some very famous ones we're going to mention. You know, the obvious ones would be Catherine of Siena and Bridget of Sweden. These are not English women, but so I'm talking more pan-Europeanly here. And so the argument that he makes is that as women are removed from external life, it affords them, if they have the time, more opportunity to explore an interior life. And funny thing does happen that women come to dominate charismatic sectors of late medieval society, sort of charismatic belief and expression of religiosity. Women become very significant among mystical movements during this time. And given the nature of the course, we have not talked about mysticism here. I may have obliquely alluded to it. What mysticism is a practice. It's the notion that through very, very disciplined contemplation from a spiritual perspective, it is perhaps possible to have, at least for the briefest moment, an ecstatic union with God. And it's this notion that, and so this is what mysticism means. Obviously, the word mystic has come to have different connotations attached to it over time, but in the strict sense that we're talking about it here, that's what it alludes to. And so you have a lot of very famous female mystics who appeared during this time, during this late medieval period, Renaissance period. We already mentioned Catherine of Siena and Bridget of Sweden, and I should note, parenthetically, if you manage to make it to Siena, and I hope you do many times, it's a wonderful city. Unfortunately, with the coronavirus, I don't think anybody's going to be visiting anytime soon. But you go to the cathedral in Siena, and you see there the relics of Catherine of Siena. They basically have her head there, which is a little grisly when you think about it in the specific, but in the abstract, it gets back to this importance of saintly relics and networks of spiritual power in Europe. And she was a very high quality mystical saint. There's another woman, actually, with whom you will become familiar if you haven't already. This woman named Marjorie Kemp. And as an alternative reading, since I was changing readings once we had the coronavirus strike and we needed to do something else, I've assigned to you about the first 75 pages of the book of Marjorie Kemp. If you'll probably realize that when you download this, you're getting the entire damn book because this is an out-of-copyright translation that's available freely without me getting sued if I give it to you. And so I've given you the whole thing. And if you get inspired, yeah, read the whole book. It's fascinating. She's a fascinating woman. We're going to read part of her early life because she's interesting first from the aspect of her spiritual life, but also from her activity as somebody who tried to set up a business as an independent woman and ended up not going so well. So we'll talk about her when we talk about her, and I'll probably put up a discussion board for her specifically from both perspectives. You also in England have Julian of Norwich, a very famous mystic during this period, and then Catherine of Genoa, just to name the most prominent ones. And again, this is a pan-European phenomenon, as Hurley was dealing with it. Women also become prominent in groups such as the Brotherhood of the Free Spirit, one of these lay confraternity groups that tends to verge into heresy during the medieval period. And when the concern of witchcraft begins to become much greater as you leave the late Middle Ages into early modernity. It's often women against whom accusations are made. And so it's a sort of negative notion of spirituality that they become very much associated with as well. Sometimes, well, I would never say justly, because the whole thing's crazy in terms of people, the way people were treated by the Inquisition when it gets itself up to running prosecutions against witches. But it's something that does become very much associated with women more so than men. And so this leads us back to our basic question: did women have a renaissance? Well, I think you can assume from the English example, economically and European for that matter, that Joan Kelly is basically right. Maybe not so much, but if there was a renaissance for women, it may have been in this interior life, where denied and opportunities in a more public sphere and having them restricted, constricted, constrained during the late medieval period made these women turn inward, and that's where their energy goes, and that's how it manifests itself. And one of the obvious, by going to the interior, it eventually publicly manifests itself by the cults that are associated with these women once they're canonized, the ones who are in fact canonized ultimately. And having said that, we've said our piece on women. It's one of those things that we can explore in much greater depth, and in another course certainly I would, but I wanted to at least get it on the board in this course so you could understand it, at least from the English perspective. And actually, we're beginning to wind this thing down a little bit. There are two big topics left in the syllabus. I'll be talking about the demographic stuff, which is the Great Famine and the Black Death, in our next installment, which I will divide over 2 or 3 sections since it's a fairly long, complex thing. And then finally, we'll finish up with 100 Years' War. Actually, there's one thing I'm sort of curious to know, and I may ask you this in an email, and I would encourage you to respond. Given our current circumstance, obviously, I'd written that editorial about the Black Death and the coronavirus. Pandemics have become a topic of much more current interest. And in this course, my remarks on the Great Famine and the Black Death are very much tailored to England. Let me know if you'd like a more comprehensive treatment of this because of the current interest in it. Because in my other courses, particularly the late medieval course, I deal with it in a more pan-European way. And if you would like a bit more detail, and I wouldn't expect anything more from you in terms of answering your exams. I expect you to talk about England in the exams. But if you'd like to know more, let me know. And what I can do is I can give you the fuller version of that, where we get a little bit more down into cases and technical matters. And I wouldn't mind doing it. It's the easiest thing for me. I have both versions. I can pull out whichever one I want. I guess I could do them both. But, that'd be a little bit of work. I'd have to do this talking head thing maybe more than you would want or I would want. Well, let me know, because that is an option that we can avail ourselves of in terms of discussing a topic that's become very current because of the circumstance we find ourselves in, where I find myself in my backyard on a very lovely day talking to you guys on tape. So I'll just sort of put that out there and let me know. I'll leave that entirely up to you all as I hear from you. If there seems to be a consensus for it, I'll go with the broader, more comprehensive treatment of that. And that being said, that's enough for today. As is ever the case in this day, be well, be careful, socially distance yourselves. We're all going to have to do this for a while for the benefit of all of us. It is this peculiar thing where by cutting ourselves off from one another, we become part of a larger community. Because by doing that, you were thinking about the welfare of the broader community. And, I would wish that your year had gone in a different way and ended in a different way. But that being said, as it's ending in this way, we should learn everything we can from the experience and take it with us, because you're experiencing something that's not been experienced in this country since the great influenza epidemic more than a century ago now. And this is going to be one of those sort of watershed events in the life not just of America but of the world. What were people's experiences during this time, and how people will eventually make sense of it as historians begin to write about it in terms of what it was, how it was handled, and how people responded to it, and its ultimate impact on society. I'd mentioned actually in passing at the very end of the university's lecture, we may have very different universities after this, and it's something that will wind itself out over time. With that being said, that's enough for a day. I've rattled on long enough. I need to get this thing uploaded, and we'll talk to you again. And I'll be emailing you again very, very soon. So take care, be safe, goodbye.